Thank you all for joining us here today. My name is Jack Corby. I'm the Vice President of Stevens Strategy. We're very excited today to be talking about accreditation and technology, and we have some wonderful guests here. Before we get started and we do some introductions for those who may be new to us, Stevens Strategy is a higher education consulting firm focused on helping colleges and universities strengthen their strategic position, improve institutional effectiveness, and ensure long-term financial sustainability. We've been in operation for over 25 years, partnering with over 150 different campuses across 400 projects. We have a team of retired presidents, provosts, senior leaders who guide and partner with our institutions today. Before we dive in, like I said, I want to have us time to introduce our speakers, and then we will hear from Alison Griffin, who will do kind of a brief overview of the topic, and then I'll kick it over to my colleague Kathryn Dodge to moderate our conversation today. We will have time for Q&A at the end, right around the 12:45 Eastern mark. So if you have any questions, feel free to use the Q&A box at the bottom, and we'll make sure to get you your questions towards the end of this webinar. To do some introductions, Alison Griffin, thank you for being here with us today. She is a higher education leader with nearly 30 years of experience in federal, state, policy, and nonprofit leadership. She's been a senior policy advisor on Capitol Hill, guided policy at WASCUC, and led national engagement for Strata Education Foundation. Known for connecting policies, practice, and storytelling, she's a regular contributor to Forbes on a wide range of higher education topics. She currently serves as a senior fellow of Colorado Mountain College, Isaac School, and supported creative economic partnerships. She's a trustee at Colorado Mesa University, having been appointed by Governor Jared Polis in 2019. Alison, thank you for being with us today.
Thank you for having me.
I appreciate it. Next is Leah Matthews. She is the Executive Director and CEO of the Distance Education Accreditation Committee, DEAC, a federally and CHIA recognized accreditor with nearly a century of leadership of quality assurance in distance learning. She's led DEAC since 2013, overseeing accreditation for more than 100 institutions, serving 2.5 million students nationally and internationally. She previously served as Vice President in Recognition Services for the Council of Higher Education and Accreditation, CHIA, where she managed recognition reviews for 60 regional, national, and programmatic accreditors. Leah, thank you for being with us today. And last, but certainly not least, is Maria Toyoda. She's the president and CEO of WASC Senior College and University Commission. As WASC's new leader, she's guided organizations' advancements and standards that promote both rigor and innovation to address student debt. Before joining WASC, she was most recently the executive vice president and provost at Western New England University. She's directed interdisciplinary programs in U.S. and abroad and held fellowships at the Council of Foreign Relations and the Social Science Research Council. Maria, thank you for being with us today.
Thanks, Jack.
And moderating our conversation is my esteemed colleague, Kathryn Dodge. Kathryn brings over 30 years of leadership and experience in higher education policy, publishing career education administration at a public arts institution, and teaching doctoral students at a land-grant and private institution. She joined Stevens Strategy 2 years ago as a senior consultant and leads our accreditation practice. Before joining Stevens Strategy, she served as a decade as the state higher education executive officer, the New Hampshire Higher Education Commission. Kathryn, thanks for moderating this conversation and being here with us today.
Thanks, Jack. It should be fun.
I'll kick it now over to Alison to give an overview of the topic and a synopsis of her recent AEI paper, where she explores how data and technology can help modernize and strengthen the accreditation process.
Very good. Thank you so much, Jack, and thank you to you and Kathryn and the entire team at Stevens Strategy for having me and giving me the opportunity to talk a bit about a paper that I authored earlier this year on the topic of technology and accreditation. So I'm going to spend the next 7 or 8 minutes covering a few points. I'm going to talk about the origin of the paper and the concept. I will share a few key reflections from financial services and healthcare, and then also share at a very high level some of the recommendations that were in the paper. I don't expect that all of our guests today have had the opportunity to review the paper, and so I've included a QR code. If you want to take a quick second and just download that code before we get started, that way you have access to the paper either during our conversation today or for your reading pleasure after we conclude. But as Jack said, I think we could pull down the slide. But as Jack said, Alison Griffin, I'm a writer, I'm a policy analyst, and I'm also a university trustee. And so I've spent my career looking at issues of accreditation through the lens of policymaking, but also through the lens of a university trustee who has seen firsthand the resources, the process leverages the anxiety that it sometimes produces and how it drives improvement or doesn't in our institution's day-to-day work. So this paper emerged from a simple observation. Other highly regulated industries have figured out how to use technology to shift from periodic, retrospective compliance exercises to continuous, real-time quality monitoring. And I argue in the paper that higher education has not made the same shift. The timing felt right. The April 2025 executive order on accreditation reform from the Trump administration created an opening just for us to ask, what if we reimagined this? And so I agreed to write a paper for the team at the American Enterprise Institute alongside a number of other colleagues who examined different issues in accreditation. And I laid out the problem in stark terms, and I mentioned this in the paper. One example, a simple NSEAC review, over 400,000 pages of documentation. At 40 pages an hour, that is 5 years of full-time reading for one reviewer. So literally impossible to comprehensively review an agency in that case with current methods. So meanwhile, through my own experience at institutions, they are pouring years into preparing self-studies. Faculty step away from teaching. Administrators tend to hire consultants. We've created what organizational theorists call Goodhart's Law in action. When a measure becomes a target, it stops being a good measure. And so institutions are oftentimes optimizing for the review and perhaps not optimizing for quality improvement. And so critically, problems can develop and persist for years, potentially between reviews, and it might create the potential for blind spots. So I mentioned I was going to touch on 2 other industries that I spent time researching. The first is healthcare. So healthcare's evolution is instructive to us in higher education. Hospital accreditation through the Joint Commission started much like ours. Periodic site visits, peer evaluations, subjective standards, but they've dramatically outpaced us. Take Johns Hopkins. It's an example I use in the paper. They now use real-time dashboarding, tracking 10 key performance indicators. Administrators can identify patient flow, bottlenecks immediately rather than discovering problems months later or even weeks later in a report. So healthcare learned that focused, continuous monitoring of meaningful metrics beats comprehensive periodic documentation. So more noise isn't necessarily just more signal. And then in financial services, I learned that financial services offers an even more striking example. JP Morgan Chase implemented an AI-enhanced anti-money laundering system that monitors transactions in real time, achieving a 95% reduction in false positives while they maintained detection accuracy. Bank of America recently developed systems that process millions of transactions per minute with real-time alerts. Response times dropped from up to 2 months to immediate notification. And so for me, the key insight from both sectors wasn't necessarily full replication, but it just prompted me to ask, how could we help higher education better understand what is happening at the institutional, department, or programmatic level? What would data actually show us more in real time than through a periodic process? And how could we reimagine just that fundamental shift in the relationship between the regulated and potentially the regulator? And so I'll outline just really quickly 4 top-line recommendations. I know we'll get into these in our discussion today, but at a high level, I offered that perhaps we convene a task force. I do think task forces play an important role in understanding the dynamic and different perspectives in the ecosystem. I suggest that we launch some pilot programs, potentially start with 25 or 40 institutions across Carnegie classifications, sectors, and regions, and potentially test some continuous monitoring on a limited set of key indicators. Third, I think we need to establish some data standards. The lack of standardized data across institutions can potentially be a barrier. Do we need common definitions and reporting methods? I think that's left for discussion of those of us in the space. But I do think some data standards are necessary. And then finally, I think we need to research benchmark validity. Many of our current metrics lack empirical foundation. And I think a deeper look into what researchers might find in establishing some of those evidence based criteria could do to enhance our accreditation process. So, in closing, I know Kathryn will transition to a conversation. For me, this wasn't just about adopting technology, but it's really about reimagining the relationship between quality assurance and institutional improvement. And I hope that we can spend some time dissecting and potentially disagreeing on some of the ideas that I've laid out in the paper. Thanks so much. Kathryn, I think you might be on mute. Forgive me.
Okay. Okay. Can everybody hear me now? Okay. Thank you for that comprehensive overview of the paper. Really well done. One of the things I just want to clarify is you referenced NSECI. And if our listeners aren't familiar with that term, that is the group. Alison, why don't you tell the group what that is?
So I essentially define NSECI as almost the accreditor of accreditors. So it's a federal body that reviews all of our accreditors that are participating on behalf of our institutions and federal government in the Title IV financial aid programs.
Right, right. And then Council for Higher Education Accreditation is another organization that recognizes accreditors as well. I know that Maria has done some things that WASC is already doing that's really interesting. And I wonder if we want to start with Leah, because you have been working with institutions who are tuned into technology for a very long period of time. How did Alison's comments and how did her paper land on you, Leah?
Well, I always appreciate the opportunity to hear about how accreditation can improve. Accreditation should hold itself accountable to quality improvements in its own processes. And certainly looking at institutional data is really key to accreditor effectiveness. At DEAC, we've been using technologies in lots of ways to evaluate institutional effectiveness. On an annual basis, our institutions provide us with graduation rate data that we look at on a program by program basis. And the institution also needs to show us how they're using that data internally for their program reviews of different subject areas, for retention and student support efforts. And when data do indicate that there is maybe a decline in student performance or student assessment, what are the strategies the institution's improving to address those issues? A couple weeks away from launching our new online data submission system. It's our annual report, but we took a year to really calibrate how we're gathering cohort information. Because wrapping your arms around the cohort of students that is moving through a program of study together is really an important way to analyze retention, completion, student academic progress, satisfactory academic progress, all of those things on a cohort basis. And in many of our distance education programs, we're organized on a competency-based system. And so organizing sort of the cohort around competency-based is another layer of complexity that we're really working hard on to try to understand how students who are in different places in the curriculum across the spectrum of a program are making sufficient progress. We use the data that comes to DEAC from our annual reports in a couple of different ways. We use it to evaluate the institution's effectiveness in achieving their mission. And we keep our process very mission focused because there's so many different subject areas covered by distance education in the DEAC portfolio that we really want to use our data effectively in looking at accomplishing mission. But it also gives us a lens on institution performance in a distance education setting. So institutions that are meeting DEAC accreditation standards, we have expectations based on degree category levels on sort of what the baseline graduation rates should be. And we use our annual report data to sort of calibrate around our own benchmarking of graduation rates at each degree level to include non-degree and certificate and diploma programs. And then each year we sort of revisit our own benchmarking that we use to track sort of the completion rate pace at our institutions. This is by no means an easy process. It is complicated. And each institution has sort of their unique approaches to supporting their students and delivering their academic content and engaging in distance education pedagogies. And so all of those sort of factor into what the ultimate result is. And is that Are students graduating, demonstrating competencies? Have they been assessed along the way for academic achievement and progress? And how does that tell the story of the institution achieving its mission? Thank you, Kathryn.
That was a comprehensive response as well. Maria.
Thanks, Kathryn, and thanks, Alison. I should first note that I reached out to Alison after reading a piece that she did for AEI initially on the topic of continuous monitoring and the model that she outlined in the healthcare sector. And it very much aligned with the thinking within WASC that this is what, data, and we're not quite there all the way, but this is what access to data and analytics can eventually get us to a point. And when I had this conversation with Alison, we talked a lot about what's kind of the dream, in the future for how you can harness data and you can harness, AI, for instance, to get to the point where you have reliable, timely data and it's measuring the things that you want to measure. And I just want to underscore what Alison was saying about, data dictionaries and common understandings and common timeframes and so forth for collecting data is essential. And, at WASC, we are in the early stages of thinking about all the collaborations we'd like to pursue in order to get to a point where we can, reach that kind of a common understanding of how the data can be used. So at WASC, we generally use three big tools for the kind of monitoring that we do. Probably our best known tool is called KID, for Key Indicators Dashboard. I know that Alison and Leah are both familiar with it, but there's a range of outcomes data that's on that dashboard. And I should say that over the past year, we've made several improvements or enhancements to that dashboard so that now you could look at return on investment from the perspective of price at the programmatic level, and you can look at it from the perspective of debt levels. And as an institution, and so that's great for the consumer. You can actually look at an institution and at the programmatic level what those outcomes are for the average graduate. And you can compare peer institutions with each other to see where they are, because we accredit so many different types of institutions, ranging from graduate only or Bible colleges to large state systems to small liberal arts colleges, that we always have to start with a mission. And then from that mission, we sort of derive from there what the important metrics are going to be and how you interpret it. Because one thing that I think we would all agree on is that metrics in and of themselves are not meaning. They're just measurement. We make meaning of those metrics through the framework that we bring to it when we analyze it. And so another tool that we introduced this year into KID is a data narrative tool. So if you were an institution and you wanted to see how you were doing from any number of perspectives, we have frameworks and guidelines, and you can basically create a data story from the metrics that we make available. The second thing, and I would say that the second and third tools, they're not as flashy, but for institutions, these are and as accreditors, these are incredibly important tools. One is we get a fall enrollment report from every institution, and that's usually a really solid indicator right now, right off the bat, about whether an institution needs follow-up or not. And then that is then supplemented by an annual report, which is a primarily financial report that comes at the end of the fiscal year for our institutions. And those things together, if you're thinking about protection for the student, those two things together really make up the biggest part of monitoring. And then, as Alison says, as we develop these tools and as we apply them more rigorously across our system, you can get to the point where you're spending those fifth year or 10th year, or, different accreditors have different periods of accreditation, but you're spending that on things that really matter, on the kinds of things that require discussion and they require a deep dive into mission and where you're making meaning of that data. Monitoring doesn't replace all of that, but what it does is it takes away some of the heavy lifts that have to be done every 10 years, where everybody scrambles and then there's a task force and then there's multiple committees to write these self-studies. And I would say that there's a page that institutions and people who lead these pre-accreditation team report writing can take from software engineers, because software engineers have long built into their code a kind of a built-in test, unit tests that develop along with the code as it gets improved and written. The tests go along with it. And so they're designed right into the code. And in the same way, when departments and faculty are looking at curriculum, start with the assessment, start with the design in a design process way. Think about what the assessment part of this is going to look like. And, that doesn't require necessarily sophisticated, data analytics or anything. Just think about how you're going to assess those things. And I think in the end, that really does improve the entire assessment journey, that institutions go through.
Right. And there's been a lot of talk about mission and clarity there, and then this meeting making idea. And I'm wondering, for schools that are new at the concept, what are the 2 or 3 things that they have to keep in mind? I mean, Marie, you just said, like, how sophisticated? Do they need to hire tech specialists? Do they need to bring in an outside view to help them think through what they're trying to assess and how they should design the assessment? Where should an institution start if they say, I know I need to get better at this? It sounds like my accreditor might be doing as well. Where do they start? How do they not be intimidated by the concept?
I would say that I'm the survivor of many strategic planning exercises. And one of the, I think the most painful parts of strategic planning are often struggles around what do we stand for and who's our audience and who are our students. If you are largely drawing from, let's say, a 25-mile radius of, local your audience, your mission, the way that you view the use of data is really going to be very different from, let's say, a major state institution or an R1 institution, And so you really have to know yourself. And that you could hire strategists and consultants, but it still requires everybody in your institution to be on board with what it is that you stand for, who your audience is. Take a page out of, let's say, what admissions officers do. They know their audience really, really well. And they know what the tolerance is for price and, for financial aiding and all of that. And that's where I would start. Know who your students are. Why are they coming to your institution? What do they want to get out of your institution? What do they value in getting a degree or a certificate from your institution? That's the starting place for deciding what data you're going to collect. There's a ton of other stuff, obviously, that you have to collect because you have to report to IPEDS and that sort of thing. But on top of that, you really need to think about what you want to collect for your own reasons. So
Right. And IPEDS is the Integrated Post-Secondary Education Statistics. Did I remember that correctly?
Data system.
Data systems. And it's really 2 or 3 years behind. So we really don't have access to that until. Alison, what do you think about those ideas that Leah and Maria have put forward? How did that resonate for you?
So they absolutely resonated. And I will say both Leah and Maria and other colleagues across the accreditation community have been incredible thought partners since the paper came out, actually offering me some real deep insight into what their organizations, their agencies are doing on this topic of accreditation and technology. You've heard directly from Leah and Maria on tools that their organizations have built and ways that they're exploring these topics. And so some of what they shared really gets at the heart of what I wanted to do, which was really start a conversation. I will say one point of criticism that I've received, not necessarily from my two colleagues on the call, but a lot of questions about peer review. Like, why are you suggesting that we dismantle peer review? And that's actually nowhere in the paper. I actually think that the opportunity that everyone may be missing in the suggestions and recommendations is that technology could actually free our peer reviewers to do what humans do best, which is to interpret and contextualize and build relationships with peers across the higher ed ecosystem. Right now, our peer reviewers spend so much time verifying and validating and checking that documentation exists, numbers add up. That is work that machines can do. But machines cannot do the work of building those intimate relationships and having conversations with peers who directly understand what is happening on a campus and are positioned to actually give suggestions and make connections. And so I think by enabling new technologies and adopting technologies, we actually create an opportunity for our community to be more collaborative across a quality assurance.
Right. Right. Um, One of three is part of a group of formally labeled regional accreditors, and that group has recently, as I understand it, come to say they are advancing student success, and in doing so, they want to use AI solutions to be more involved in the learning evaluation process and the transfer of credit. And I'd like for her to talk a little bit about that. And Leah, before Maria talks a little bit about that, I'm wondering if you can speak to how your institutions use it in those areas that might come up to the accreditor's attention. That's learning, measuring the progress of learning, as well as transfer credit. Are you aware of that for your institutions?
Well, certainly. Transfer of credit is always sort of top of mind for students and institutions as students are sort of working their way through their educational pathways. In looking at this conversation about data, Alison brings up a really important point about the human involvement. We can extract data from our student information systems and our learning management systems. I mean, they've been beautifully built to give us a lot of data. I think some of the connections that are missed are who is able to analyze that data, make sense of it, present it in coherent ways to institution leadership. And then where are we sort of tracking that effort into impactful changes and modifications at the institution and program level? And so I think where we need to start addressing our challenge as accreditors is bridging that gap between mass stockpiles of data in all of these systems, whether it's for iPads, annual reporting, programmatic level reporting, licensure results. All of these things tell the story about the institution. Who is interpreting this in effective and meaningful ways to chart the future for the institution, its strategic planning, its institutional effectiveness? And if we want to talk about transfer of credit, how do we know that student learning has sufficiently prepared that student to have their credit accepted at another institution in this accredited sort of atmosphere, ecosystem that we're in? And can maybe AI technologies help us with that assessment? We've used a lot of sort of artificial barriers around transfer of credit for far too long. Can we bring about more meaningful opportunities for students that are in state authorized, programmatically accredited degree programs to be able to reach their academic goals across sort of their whole trajectory for learning?
So you would support Alison's recommendations on moving forward, and where would an institution start to mine all of the information that you just said? We have to start by pulling it apart and understanding it. Do they hire? I mean, I don't know how they do it. I'm just, if I was running an institution, I don't know where I would start on that.
You start with getting a baseline understanding of what your technology availability is and what can you garner from
Okay.
the systems that are in place. If you can't get good answers to that question, then you probably start to need to think about hiring people with better
Okay.
skills. And so often in the accreditation process, we see stockpiles of data that are not being used or that are not understood, or that there aren't sufficient resources available to hire the people to interpret these data results. So really at a leadership level, understanding where your data sets are, the qualifications and the capabilities of the people interpreting it for you.
That's really important. Really important. Maria, have you had to change your processes at Western New England and or at WASC to align with that recommendation?
Well, I left Western New England too late to do anything about that, or too early to do anything about that. But I think my experiences there and at other institutions will resonate with people on this call, which is that when we make decisions about accepting transfer credits, we do it in isolation. We do it in a siloed way, and people will recognize the dilemma of an Excel spreadsheet that the registrar's office keeps that manually lists all the courses that your institution is willing to take as transfer courses. When now we have amazing work being done by a number of both nonprofits and for-profits collecting, granular level information, data, syllabi, assignments and things like that on courses that institutions will voluntarily give to these places. Places like Credlens and Credential Engine and so forth have, and Credential Engine nonprofit. You can basically join in and share your data and then access other people's data. And it just occurred to me, there's we think of these things as such siloed ways, and we're just repeating our work. Institution after, sometimes department by department, we're replicating that work. And so there's a real potential here for us to be able to harness the kinds of huge databases that are currently being created at the course level. And, it occurred to me that one way of doing this, and I don't know if anyone has really thought about it this way, but, institutions can upvote particular courses in the way that you might upvote, a Reddit posting or something like that, as a way to maybe as a marker of confidence in a particular course or a particular syllabus. And so there are just, I think, so many ways in which technology and entrepreneurs really can think about the way that we facilitate transfer credits using the technology that's already available to us.
That's great. Have you seen any change in your institution's success patterns given the use of the kids system that you have in place, that stands for
Key Indicators Dashboard? And yeah, we recently did a survey of our institutions and their use of KID. We asked them, what do you use it for? And what do you get out of it? And the responses were really, really fantastic. People are paying attention to their own data. They are paying attention to their peer data, and they are making decisions, again, at the individual institutional level about what they want to focus on as a result of that. Right? So if it's going to be, a particular major or program where maybe the retention isn't as good, they'll do a deep dive and try to to find the reasons why they're not as successful. They may be, I think sometimes that they're very encouraged, let's say, by a positive trajectory that they're making it. And they go back to that data and say, we beat last year. We did better than the year before. So, what also strikes me is that we all know how costly it is and how difficult it is to find people who can do the kind of institutional research. So it's not a problem for, let's say large state systems or large well-funded universities, but, the majority of institutions in our country are small. And here we are replicating at the institutional level, every institution doing the same work in the same way, again and again and again. It's really inefficient, right? So, our dashboards and our other tools don't replace the need necessarily for an institutional research office, but what it does is provides some of the data and some of the visualizations that make it easier for our institutions to just quickly grab that information and do the peer comparisons.
Right. Well, Alison had some very practical suggestions in terms of recommendations. And, it's good for us to always try to make lemonade when there's some lemons around, and we're in the transition period right now, I think. And I'm wondering what you, Leah, and Maria think of the recommendations around task force, launching pilot programs, establishing data standards, researching benchmark validity, and Maria, your work with CRAC, which is the regional accreditors. What is I mean, Leah, you said collaboration. I mean, what are your, if you could wave a magic wand, or what do you see? How do we make lemonade at this point?
Well, Maria raises a good point that many institutions are small, that they don't have the depth of resources to bring in institution research experts. We've recognized that at DEAC. We tend to attract startup, newly founded online institutions that are just sort of getting their legs and getting started in this process. In recognition of that, we brought an institution researcher onto our team of our staff just to be a resource to institutions who are trying to develop their practices around institutional effectiveness and assessing student learning, tracking these metrics, how to extract that data out of their systems and make meaning. So if there's maybe something we want to do as a community of accreditors, maybe we could create a consortium of institution researchers that get steeped in accreditation practice, not just their own institution practice, but across the spectrum of accreditation, and turn that resource into something institutions can draw upon to build their own experience and sort of relevance in this space of data assessment. There's lots of conversations that take place among accreditors. We're all sort of talking about these issues and how we help our institutions improve. I would love to see those practices continue. Just one more point, Alison, you brought up the idea of why don't we have like standardized benchmarking in the United States? And boy, that is a conversation I've been hearing for the last 25 years in this work, because we are not a national system. We are a widely diversified, decentralized system of higher education. And what would it mean to try to implement a standardized benchmark across higher education in the US? I think we should continue to talk about that, but also look at how individual accreditors in the context of their settings and institution mission are doing this work sort of effectively within their own practice.
May I clarify one quick point? So
Yeah.
my recommendation is not a national data standard. It's aligned data standards when we think about programs or specific disciplines. So getting a little bit more at the granular level, not proposing a national data standard.
Oh, okay. I'm so glad you clarified that, Alison.
Thank
But
you for raising the point.
Well, yeah, it is something that is discussed from time to time. I've seen it brought up in NEGREG. I've seen it brought up in the NSECI conversations. What can we do to raise student performance nationally? I think the blunt instrument is to try to have, national benchmarks, which I don't think would really service the features of institutional assessment well.
I'm excited by the fact that we have over 3,600 different missions of institutions in this country. Absolutely agree to that point and appreciate the opportunity to clarify.
And negotiated rulemaking is what happens when the department is thinking about making changes in their expectations of accreditors, if folks don't know what NEGREG is. Maria, you were going to say something.
Well, it pertains to NEGREG, and it is a reality. As much as we would like there to be, more nuance when we talk about these things, there is a reality where NEGREG over the next, let's say, 6 months. Right now, they're getting into the workforce Pell reporting requirements and regulations. They'll be getting into aspects of the spending bill, the One Big Beautiful Bill provisions, and in there, it's going to take a while to understand what the requirements will be. But there are accountability measures in that bill that all institutions are going to have to start complying with and reporting on. And it's unclear right now exactly, not just what, is going to get reported, but how it's going to get reported and how these things are going to get measured. And so one thing that we could look at as probably one of the more difficult challenges for our institutions is reporting out at the programmatic level on outcomes, particularly salary outcomes for, again, at the programmatic level. And as you noted, Kathryn, a lot of the data that we get through iPads or the college scorecard are already lagged by about 3 years. And so how do we, how exactly are institutions going to have to report this and measure? How are they going to find out that information? And this is where, just to get to what Leah was saying, that is where institutional accreditors like us can learn a lot from programmatic accreditors who have been doing that work for decades. From what is it, dialing for dollars from those days all the way up to, scraping the web to get that information, or trying to, get that information from places like Burning Glass and so forth. So there's just a lot of questions out there. We are going to, like it or not, we are going to have to get to a point where we have to come to some agreement about what we mean at a national level when we're talking about outcomes. There will be adjustments, obviously, for, what the state median income is or what regional, median income might be, but there is going to be a common definition.
Thank you. Right. I want to make sure we're leaving time for folks to surface some of their questions, and we have two that have come up. One is about transfer credit, and is the problem really transfer of credits or the time the student will need to be in higher education, is the first question. And you can think about who wants to tackle that one. And the other one that has come up is about what are some of the digital tools that others are using to collate their data, their data online, and moving from paper to organizing data online. And we also told the group we would be talking about guardrails, ethical issues to be considered. So we have the transfer, we have tools, and we have guardrails. Who wants to jump in here?
I will just give quick voice to the fact that I did cursory research to figure out what tools institutions might be using. And I had a hard time identifying single tools or methods that are maybe more, I say universally, but sort of universally adopted. There seem to be a lot of institutionally, centric built tools and programs. I don't know, Maria or Leah, if you have some examples, but everything I found was built by the institution themselves.
I would say a really good starting point, if you want to do this research, is to attend one of several conferences that take place every year that bring experts in these fields, like the Online Learning Consortium Conference, WCET, EDUCAUSE, USADLA. A lot of these sort of associations around education technology bring these panels of experts to their conference events. It's a really good way to network, gather a lot of information in a short period of time about what sort of technology and analytics tool is best for you. Many of them are quite expensive, and so the homegrown kind of institution developed practice is another way that this is dealt with. But I would suggest maybe setting aside time in your calendar and within your budget to attend an event where you can really get sort of the most up-to-date activities that are supporting institutions in this area.
Yeah, I would add your either AIR, Association for Institutions, or your local or state level, AIR, that they'll have your regional and local AIR conferences are really great for seeing what other people are doing. And, institutions do homegrown because they think it's cheaper to start with, and then it just gets more and more expensive as time goes on. And I think that probably the most important thing for most institutions to realize is you're probably already using multiple data systems, and in offices that probably don't interact with even that often, and more likely than not, those tools that they are using are AI enabled. And the problem here is about data integration. So I would start right off by doing an inventory of what tools your different departments are using. And that goes from admissions to facilities to your business office. Business offices are probably the most advanced in terms of their willingness and their experimentation with using AI tools and data tools. I'd say admissions offices are probably pretty sophisticated about that. But, we have problems of systems talking with each other. And when you try to get them to talk with each other, it turns out to be an extremely expensive proposition. So I think it's pretty important for institutions to first do, to do an inventory of what you're already using, and then map out how those systems do or don't talk with each other, and And, is it taking somebody on the back end, weeks and months to clean that data so that it's usable and that sort of thing. And so I think a lot of institutions leak a lot of expense, basically cost, because offices aren't talking with each other. There's a lot of siloing going on, and different systems are just different systems. They're not talking with each other.
Great. Someone has just posted a resource from Wed Ed Tech, and I know Jack is going to work on getting links to folks for some of these guardrails, ethical guardrails.
Just shake your head, Kathryn. There's some good stuff about, and then there's also really good stuff that institutions could be doing right this second, even before you implement anything, and because there's a whole lot of I would say policy infrastructure that needs to be in place before you even embark on something like this. And by the way, I mean, your students are already using this. If you're using the Microsoft suite, you are already using this. And I would say that, make sure you have a transparency statement, making sure that everybody knows that this is what you're doing. If you're collecting data or using AI to analyze that data, you have to be absolutely transparent about it. You have to make sure that your use is consistent with FERPA and other, privacy rules. In most situations, you're going to have to get consent on the kinds of data that you're collecting or analyzing through AI. You want to make sure that the kinds of data that you're collecting are purpose limited, that you're not just collecting for the sake of collecting. So decide, what you're collecting and why. You're going to have to you're going to make sure that there's encryption, and you're going to have to vet your vendors, well. But probably most importantly, you have to make sure everybody on campus is trained in this stuff. And I don't mean necessarily using it, but trained in the policies and trained in the expectations that your institution's going to have.
Great. Thank you.
I would add, Kathryn, that AI is certainly reshaping the reality of the accreditation process. It's changing student behavior. It's influencing instructional designs. It is certainly starting to appear within accreditation processes, whether it's institution use, evaluator use. And it really is something I think that for higher education, we need to stay focused on three things in this AI journey that we're all on. One is supporting students with appropriate use practices and AI. Second, I think we have to make sure we're building in authentic assessment of student learning. What is the student actually achieving as their competencies, and how can we verify that and validate that in these ever-changing sort of instructional design models? And then thirdly, how do we preserve academic integrity along the way with this whole ecosystem? Transparent AI use policy, I think, to Maria's point, is really important, that institutions have their protocols and their policies and evidence of how they're implementing them, and that we deal with any misconduct appropriately, and that sort of the human oversight of all of this remains essential to AI integration in higher education and in learning.
Yes, that's great. That's great. There was a specific question for you, Leah, about most effective method for calculating cohorts when operating in a rolling enrollment model.
Mm-hmm. So what we're looking at for sort of identifying cohorts is looking at historical data for sort of the average amount of time to completion in a competency-based program, and sort of using that average to establish sort of the beginning date for when a cohort starts and the ending date for when it within a maybe 150% time have they achieved it. And so that's your cohort. And then that cohort over probably multiple years, how have they moved through the system of programs, courses along the way, and how have you tracked them as a cohort? And you can probably split that data up in maybe some mini cohorts or individual student progress, but overall, just sort of looking at a cohort of students in any particular program and their progress along the way as a group that sort of had consistency in instructional design, student assessment, learning resources available to them in the program, the qualifications of the faculty. I mean, a cohort is going to have some similarities in the learning experience that should tell the institution what has been effective in that experience, what needs to improve, what needs to be addressed.
Great. Thank you. We're running short on time here. And there was something about ROI and how can we expand that? Is that really working, especially for people who go back to school for something that's not as vocationally it's for their soul kind of a thing? What kind of metrics? Can we expand the definition of metrics? And there's a question about this I don't think anybody here would prevent students from getting through a program quicker. Am I right? I mean, there's this transfer question that keeps coming up.
No, that in fact, that's the kind of the
Point.
the point. Yeah, right. The whole point. Um, I just want to address the ROI question because I see that it was in the context of, a theological school, and that is something that we were also concerned about, but unfortunately, that measurement, that particular metric is going, in some form or another, going to be the measurement for whether an institution or a program is ultimately going to be eligible for Title IV funding. At least if that's the, provisions in the One Big Beautiful Bill are put into place. I think that there has been a little bit of, it really depends on how people are going to measure that ROI. We at WASC did an analysis of every program that we accredit that receives Title IV funding. And fortunately, only 2% of the programs, not the institutions, only 2% of the programs offered by our institutions sort of failed that threshold test. And none of it was theology. Oh, it's actually music and theater. So that's kind of an unfortunate consequence of this. And I think there are I think there's going to be a spirited discussion, about this in NEGREG.
Exactly.
That's good. It's deserving of it. Okay, we have 1 minute. I want to say thank you to each of you. And if there's any last moment, a phrase that you want the listeners to have to take with them, have at it. Alison?
I'll say one quick thing. I'm always open to receiving both constructive feedback and also new ideas coming out of the paper. So I would be happy to connect with anyone. I'm on LinkedIn, and you're welcome to message me. I'd be happy to connect and talk further.
Super. Thank you for writing the paper and bringing us to this point. Leah, any parting thought?
Let's keep the conversations going.
Great.
Let's share our resources, our strategies, our best efforts to really help our students accomplish their goal.
Super. Thanks. Maria?
I am going to steal mine from my predecessor at WASC, Jamie Studley, who always said, better data, better conversations.
Hear, hear. Hear, hear. Thank you all for making time for this, and stay tuned. Be well.